So this is theme 1B, for the Britain and its economic challenges from 1918 to 1979. And you just need to know a few things just for the context. You need to know the war overall cost Britain £3 billion. They lost 750,000 men, and 40% of their ships, which obviously had all their resources, were destroyed by the Germans. So after World War One, Britain was not a good place economically. Basically, after World War One, however, rationing and things like that ended. So more people had money, and basically what you've got to talk about is people had money and were buying things again, and so the economy from what it was obviously increased. And you can say shares in London alone in 1918 were at £65 million. But by 1920, they went up to 385 million. So obviously the economy is booming straight after World War One. This is called a speculative boom. However, during World War One, Britain didn't really improve its industries at all. So after World War One, they were quite flat, not energised, not updated. They didn't have the quality that countries like America and Japan, China now had. They didn't have the investment. And so, as you'd see, that speculative boom is speculative for a reason, as it only started for a little while and then it soon went into an economic crisis. And another big reason for the economic crash is everyone was spending so much, but as the industries were in decline, they couldn't keep up with the demand that actually occurred. And so actually prices then increased, and obviously then produce was not being created at the same time. And so inflation rised and unemployment soared. And that's basically what you've got to know from about 1918 to 1919. So by 1920 to 1921, that is the economic recession, right after the speculative boom. And 2 million people were unemployed, and these are in places such as Tyneside, which is Newcastle, and South Wales and Scotland, which had the ship industry. And as I said earlier, that's where 40% of the ships of Britain were destroyed in World War One. And the cost of living, due to inflation, actually rose by 25%. And you had a key word here called stagflation. Basically, inflation was rising, but wages weren't. And obviously that is what's going to cause people the hardships at home. You've got four main causes for the increased living costs and basically the economic recession. One is basically interest levels were raised by 7%. And basically what this means is it became more expensive to actually borrow. And because it became more expensive to borrow, there wasn't enough people borrowing money and putting it into the economy and getting things going again. You've also got a loss of export trade, which I said, because the industry is in decline, they no longer had the resources or the quality to compete with countries like Japan in Asia. So the textiles industry, such as that was good in like Tyneside, were no longer quality compared to the Asian community. You had underinvestment as well. America, didn't come into World War One until a little bit later again than us, and so our industries were a lot more damaged than theirs. And basically, we severely underinvested where America didn't. And that from then on, really, and World War Two as well, America dominated the British exports. Industrial relations were getting getting more sour in 1919, which I'll do that in 1C. And basically, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, had to keep giving them concessions. And this basically increased inflation as well, because they kept giving money to the people who were striking. And obviously, that didn't improve efficiency because they were striking and they were just getting paid money. And so the economy, again, is going to be faulted at that. Basically, by 1921, all you've got to know is that a Geddes Axe is basically what happened. And basically, the Geddes Axe in 1921 cut £87 million out of public spending, and that was to try and aim to reduce inflation and get the economy rolling again. Now, by 1923, you've got the first Labour government, and obviously the recession lasted from 1920 to 21, and after 21, we actually entered a period of economic recovery, which you will need to write. So, like in a mock this year, in the mock, the question was about economy from till like 1918 to 1930. So you've got to write about speculative boom, then recovery, then obviously the Wall Street crash. But as I said, by 1923, you had the first Labour government now, and Ramsay MacDonald actually did pretty well. he managed to reduce unemployment from 12%, which was roughly about 2 million, down to 6%. And he actually got inflation down to 15% to 1%. So there, with the Labour government, you can actually say they improved the economy a lot. However, inflation-wise, it only reduced to 1% because of the high unemployment still. And then the Labour government was only short-lived, which you can see in section 1A. And then the Conservative government resumed in 1924 to 1929 under Stanley Baldwin. And economically, a major thing happened under them. Churchill, who was actually Chancellor at the time, introduced something called the gold standard. All you've got to know basically about the gold standard is like a buzzword you've got to mention in the exam to get you more marks. It's basically putting a value of our currency, the sterling, the British pound, into relation with gold. And basically, this would be good in a booming economy as it would make it more expensive. And so in a booming economy, making it more expensive is going to make more profit. But as the economy was not good, this just made it too expensive and uncompetitive. And actually, although it was entering a recovery until 29, it actually hampered that recovery a lot and slowed it down. And in 1929, a very famous economic depression occurred throughout the world, known as the Wall Street crash in 1929. And this saw unemployment go up to £2 million again, and Britain had a reduction of 50% in their British exports. And at the end of 29, Labour government occurred again. And basically, Labour are obviously meant to be representing the working people. And what they did, due to the harsh economic environment, they actually planned to implement a 10% cut in unemployment assistance. And obviously the unemployed is meant to be who they arguably represent. And so basically this caused uproar in the Labour government and actually caused them to split. But the reason they had to implement this was basically because there was rumours of an unbalanced budget in 1931. And this means that the Labour government was planning to spend more than they could actually afford. And this basically caused the bankers in America to quick sell the pound. And basically what that would have happened, it would have actually destroyed our economy even further. And that is why McDonnell had to resort to such extreme things, such as the 10% cut. But nonetheless, it caused the Labour Party to fold. So as I said, the Labour government split. And basically then the King, I think it was King George, he basically, because it was in such a bad period of time, he's put away into party politics and appointed something called a national government. And this is when all the main parties, Labour, Conservatives, Liberal Party, at the time, all went into one government to try and help the economic situation at the time. And they actually introduced that 10% cut in unemployment, which didn't go down so well, but it did help the economy recover, and you can obviously use that as well. And they also introduced means testing. And this one we'll talk about in 2A. But basically, means testing is making it hard for people to get benefits. It included things like going to people's houses and actually looking at their current state of living and to see if they actually were poor. As well as that, the national government early on did something called the Special Areas Act in 1934. And basically, places like Scotland and Tyneside, which are already bad after World War I economically, like I said, but the depression hurt them even more than most places. So basically, this Special Areas Act of 1934 aimed to put money into them, but it was not enough to save them, unfortunately. So economically, you can say the national government tried to implement measures, but they weren't all that successful, although the economy continued to recover. And by 1934, we're starting to rearm. We are starting to rearm because although we're not at war yet, Germany are starting to take over places such as Abyssinia and the Manchurian crisis and things like this. And they're taking over the Saarland. So Britain was starting to actually increase its spend in the defence industry. And so as you'll see, from 1934 to 1939, which is very important to understand those two dates when you're writing about how the economy was in Britain, because it didn't really recover until 1934. 5 main things you need to know. You need to know incomes of people, the amount of money people had increased by 19%. The industry, their production rose by 23%. Gross national product, GNP, rose by 46%. Exports rose by 28%, and unemployment fell from 17%, because it went to about 3 million people in 1931, down to 8%, which was roughly about 1 million. So the economy obviously was booming. And another one you can say, another point, is if you look at the houses built in 1931, after the Great Depression, only 100,000 new homes were built that year. But by 1936, there was 300,000, and that shows how the economy recovered as there was more money and more expenditure allowed to occur. And lastly, which you can add again just to show a bit more knowledge, the economy from 1934 to 1939 actually grew by 4% every single year, and that alone shows that the economy recovered. And by stating that, and especially getting the years right, you should be getting marks. And so the economy recovered and continued to recover until about 1939. And 1939, you need to know, obviously, World War II occurred. But and then Churchill, who came in after Neville Chamberlain, he actually, what he did, he took over. He took over lots of parts of the government, known as like nationalisation. And basically, he took over ministries to try and help the production and things like that, and actually helped the economy in the end. There was 15,000 airplanes built in 1939, but by 1944, due to the taking over of the ministries and the increased production, it went to 44,000. And in the same years, it went from 6,000 tanks to 8,000 tanks. And obviously showing that is going to show how the economy recovered as we was able to use the public expenditure to build these things. And another bit of information, part of our GDP, I believe it was 15% was spent on the military in 1939, but by 1944 it went up to 54%. And that shows how the war actually took over. And actually, before the war, the economy was doing really well. And it was doing okay during the war, but after the war, it slumped quite a bit. So as you can see, in 1940, basically Britain bought a lot of supplies from America. But by 1940, Britain actually had no money. Because obviously the economy after World War I was never quite the same as it was before. And so even though recovery occurred, Britain wasn't that wealthy. And they spent a lot of money trying to get supplies from America, but in the end they had no money. Something, another buzzword, was basically put in place called the Lend-Lease Agreement. And basically this was an agreement between America and Britain that Britain would be able to get as many supplies and resources as needed, but after the war we would pay America all for it. And that was basically it throughout the war. And then after the war, 45 to 51, that's known as a period of austerity. So when the economy is greatly slumped and it's not doing too well. World War I, we had 3 billion war debt, and by World War II we had 4 billion of debt alone to the US because of the Lend-Lease Agreement. And basically our trade, again, the U-boats, the German U-boats destroyed many British ships, and basically our trade actually declined by 2/3 because obviously lots of other parts of the world were obviously destroyed and damaged trade-wise by World War II, as well as Britain. And the USA aid that it gave out to a lot of countries basically cemented their place as the biggest trade export in the world at that time. And in 1947, rationing was reintroduced after the war, which shows how the British economy was really struggling because we couldn't keep up with the demand of food, so people had to have rationing even in peacetime. In peacetime, that is the key point to show how the economy at that time was not in a good shape at all. We did get help from our friends, the Americans. We got a thing called Marshall Aid. After the World War II, basically Britain and many other parts of Europe were obviously largely in economic problems, and America was worried that we was going to go to communism. So what they did a thing called Marshall Aid, and they gave lots of money to loads of different countries to try and stop them becoming communist. And Britain actually was, I think it was the biggest recipient from that Marshall Aid with 2.7 billion. And although that 2.7 billion would obviously help us, which you can write. You could say this would obviously help the economy grow. However, there is limitations, as that's what you've got to do to get the higher marks, to get the A's and the B's. You've got to argue both sides. You basically say Britain didn't use that money to a great effect. We used it in wars, in the Korean War in 1950 to 51. I think that's when it started. There was problems in Greece, in Kenya, and we basically used that money to keep people stationed in countries such as India, which obviously Gandhi stopped, but things like that at the time was where the money was going, so it wasn't used efficiently at all. You can even see this after World War II. Japan used 20% of their GDP in infrastructure, and ours was only at 9%, and we was actually damaged just as bad as Japan. Obviously, Japan got Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which obviously was terrible, killed thousands of people. Basically, what you got to know is Japan used their money to great effect to rebuild their economy, whereas Britain didn't. And during the war, the government took over many things, many industries, known as nationalisation. And after the war, they kept on doing it. They took on many things, because basically, after World War II, they wanted to keep the so-called full employment. And basically, this was trying to keep as many people employed. And when you have private businesses, they want to go for profit. And profit can be hampered by the amount of people you have and the wages. So what a lot of businesses do, they shed jobs a lot to increase their profits. But a nationalised industry, which is government owned, doesn't look to make profit. And that is basically kind of like the post-war consensus, was basically nationalisation was a part of that, as well as the other parts, which is in 1A. Again, the nationalisation kind of like aim cost £2 billion overall, and that left us in a lot of trouble for the future. So again, after World War II, the country had good parts and bad parts in its economic ups and downs. But a good part, apart from that bit of costing £2 billion, throughout the Labour government from 45 to 50, to 51, there was never more than 300,000 people unemployed. And compared to during the 30s, there was never less than 1 million people unemployed. It shows the great effect that the nationalisation was actually having in economic terms. Not the cost of it, but the job-wise of it. Actually, contrary to what you probably think, trade actually, although it did decline during the war by 2/3, our percentage of world trade that we dominate actually improved from 1940 to 1950. We went from 17% to 20%. And obviously that increase shows that the economy was recovering. Again, much like from 1934 to 1940, the economy from 1945 to 51 actually grew by 4% each year. Now for the last part, the last kind of like bit of number 1B. This is basically what happened after World War II. There was a post-war consensus, and the economy was doing really well in the 50s and 60s due to this. Basically, the post-war consensus was basically agreeing to have low unemployment, a mix of private industries and nationalised industries, and basically these two methods there. And can never say the word, but Keynesian economics. And basically, whenever unemployment gets high, you spend to try and on like public works. So if the economy is doing bad, you will spend money to build a train track or something like that, just to get more people employed and keep the unemployment down. And that's basically what happened from the 50s to 60s, and the economy was booming in the 50s and 60s. As well as you can mention, which would be number 4, technology helped as well throughout the 50s and 60s. So as I said, the key thing you need to know whenever you're talking from Britain from 1918 to 79 is basically this word of the post-war consensus. And from 45 to roughly 60, to the end of the 60s, that is the most important thing that was happening. Because by the end of the 60s, the post-war consensus was dead. Was absolutely dead, which I will talk about later on. Said is Keynesian style economics. So when unemployment rose, public works would be employed. And basically, throughout the 50s and 60s, no more than 300,000 people were ever unemployed, which shows how the system was actually working a lot throughout that period of time. And as I said, there was a mix of nationalisation and privatisation. So there were certain businesses making profit, which was good for the economy, and certain businesses that wouldn't shed jobs, which was also good for the economy. And plus, like I said, how we used the Marshall Aid ineffectively. We actually decolonised a lot throughout the 50s and 60s, which you can see in the likes of India. Many immigrants came over the country, especially from India and the Caribbean, and basically these immigrants didn't get paid a lot. They were considered cheap labour by businesses. So although not particularly good for the individuals, it was good for the countries economically, because basically people were doing the work but at a low cost. So production was rising, which increases profit for the country, but costs of actually paying the money went down. So actually it was quite good for the economy at the time. And you can even relate that to nowadays, where a big thing about pro-immigration is people say cheap labour, because it's cheaper than businesses paying for people in their own country, because they usually want higher wages, which can obviously hamper their profits. And basically all you've got to know is that was how it was until about 1957, when Harold Macmillan came in. And basically during his time economically, you need to know one thing, and that is something called stop-go economics. And basically when unemployment got higher, got nearer to like the 300,000 mark, basically lowered interest rates and lowered taxes. So people had more money, and if people had more money, they'd be willing to get more people into jobs. And so then unemployment would decrease, but as you're spending more money, inflation then increases. And basically when inflation rose, what he did, he increased taxes and interest rates to make people have less money in their pockets. So basically what you've got to know from stop-go economics, when unemployment rose, interest rates and taxes increased. And as unemployment decreased, inflation rose. And when inflation rose, basically interest rates and taxes were lowered. And basically throughout 57 to 63, it was like a ping pong, like a table tennis match. Just keep doing one and lowering the other one. And actually throughout this period of time, the economy was quite good. People had rising living standards. The economy was growing. The economy was growing 4% again, which obviously from 34 to 39 was 4%, 45 to 50 was 4%, and 57 to 63 was 4%. However, on the other hand, which you have to obviously say, is Germany, actually, their economy was actually growing faster right now. It's at 12%. So obviously our economic growth wasn't as good as possibly our competitors such as Germany and Japan, both growing at 12%. And basically Harold Macmillan wanted to increase the economy's efficiency, and he advocated something called corporatism. And this is basically one that's not really associated with nowadays, but it's basically when businesses work with trade unions and work with the government. So there's like a tripartite system, if you'd want, when all three things are working together. Because like nowadays you see businesses and trade unions clash, their interests clash. Basically he was trying to get corporate industries, businesses and trade unions actually working together. Because if they work together, then obviously he thought the economy would naturally improve. And with this idea of corporatism, there's two main strands, two things that Macmillan created. So when you get a question in the exam from 45 to 79 economics, and you talk about Macmillan, the 50s and 60s, this is very important to talk about. He created something called NEDI and NICI, and these are basically two kind of like government programs to try and implement this corporate ideas. And NEDI was basically having corporate businesses and trade unions simply sitting down at a desk and talking to each other and having their problems resolved in a decent manner. And he thought, as they both want to do well, they would simply talk and everything would work out. However, NEDI actually had no powers of implementation. But by that, which I mean is, if they did disagree, the NEDI actually had no powers to force anything on them. So actually, although it had a nice idea, it was very weak. And NICI, a little bit like NEDI, but was NEDI is just like talking and trying to solve problems. NICI was purely an advisory council, and basically it basically its main job was trying to keep strikes down and wage restraint. So basically, Nicky was an advisory council advising trade unions and corporate industries to basically keep down the wages that their members wanted, basically. Again, much like Nicky, and this is the big weakness of the idea, neither of them have any actual power to implement things, to go, you have to do this now. So actually, although it was a good idea, they couldn't force the unions or businesses to actually do anything. So the idea was actually severely weak. And the big thing at the time in the 50s and 60s, because the economy was booming and everyone was quite well off actually, which Macmillan actually quoted in a quotation. He says, people have never had it so good. And that itself, if you use that quote in the exam, and that's quite different. It was different to most people because most people don't know quotes. It shows just how good the economy actually was for most people. But basically, a lot of people wanted to be able to buy things in this consumer boom. So they wanted more money and wage restraint. And as I'll show you with 1C in the topic of industrial relations, throughout the 50s and 60s, people were striking, trying to get more money. And basically, that is why Nicky and Eddie were really set up, to try and restrain people and stop them and try and solve these disputes that were occurring. However, by the end of 1964, which was the end of Macmillan's basically reign, he ended in 63, and Alec Douglas Home was from 63 as well to the end of 63, as he lasted around 9 months, which wasn't very long. But by 1964, 3 main problems you've got to talk about, and this will give you a lot to talk about, wise in relating to how bad the economy was in the 50s and 60s actually. So from the 50s and 60s, the early period part of it, unemployment never reached above 300,000, but by 1964 unemployment was at 800,000. That is one massive piece of information to know, because if you can explain how the 300,000 and the 800,000 relates to each other, and you can show like the disparity, you're golden for good marks there. As people wanted more things, basically we were importing a lot of things due to the consumer boom from other countries, India, America, Germany, wherever it was. But our industries were still weak. They were still very heavy industries, and they remained that way until basically Maggie Thatcher came in and went boom, privatisation. This consumer boom, basically prices. There was a prices problem. It was called a balance of payments problem. Sorry. And basically this is when we was importing too much and not exporting too much, so basically we came to debt. So that is the second point. And then you got Harold Wilson, and Harold Wilson came in 64 to 70. Because he had Edward Heath. And he basically inherited that problem of the consumer boom and debts and the rise in strikes. And he came up with something called the National Board for Prices and Incomes. This was basically a board that was created which was trying to help the situation, much like Nicky was, with the amount of people wanted to rise their wages and inflation rates and things like that. That's what it was created to do. And alongside that board, he created the Prices and Incomes Act of 1966. And basically, this freezed wages for a couple of months just to stop inflation rising. Although it helped, it was not a long-term solution at all. And so again, you argue both sides for that point, and you come down to whatever you think was is your opinion on whether Harold Wilson did anything well to help the economy there. And then also, as well as the Act of 1966, you have the Prices and Incomes Act of 1967. And this was basically allowing wage increases in businesses and in industrial companies. Basically, they can only increase their wages if they prove that they were efficient. And because the economy at the time wasn't completely efficient due to the strikes, and I think at the time we were 75% less efficient than the industries in America. So we wasn't producing what we should do for the amount of manpower that we actually had. And basically, as people wanted wages, obviously people who were working, they wanted wage increases. The Prices and Incomes Act of 1967 basically just said you can have wage increases as long as you're showing that you're actually improving your economic efficiency for the country. There's also another bit you need to know. It's quite relevant really to know, but it's helpful. It will give you the marks anyway, which I think at this point is actually a little bit harder to argue. Technology-wise, Harold Wilson in 1964 created the Ministry of Technology with Tony Benn being its head of department. And basically this was just trying to improve the economic situation by advances in technology. And although it was actually really popular, it wasn't particularly successful at improving the economic situation. However, there was one big thing that it did. It created the first supersonic passenger plane named Concorde. And that is basically what you've got to know for the Ministry of Technology bit. Harold Wilson, as well as the Prices and Incomes Acts and the board and the Ministry of Technology, he created another kind of policy called the IRC. And basically the IRC was trying to, again, this efficiency thing, was trying to promote efficiency measures in businesses and trade unions. Again, money incentive wise, like the Incomes Acts, the IRC basically gave money to companies that were showing that they were actually trying to improve their efficiency measures. As well as that, the IRC had a second point, as well as the giving money for an incentive to improve efficiency. They basically tried merging companies, as they thought if one company and one company go together, surely it's going to be better for the economy, as efficiency will improve and their knowledge will improve. But largely it was a massive failure. For instance, the example I always use is Leyland Motors and British Motor Corporation. Basically, these two did not work well. It just showed how hard it is to merge two companies. They needed £25 million to help them out, because they were doing so bad after the merge. So giving them money to help them again straight after shows how poor the IRC actually was. And especially compared to countries such as Japan and China, car-wise, we was well behind our competitors. One bit I always remember, the IRC, James Callaghan bought a car, and it kept breaking down, and it was actually from Leyland Motors and British Motor Corporation. That just shows, again, highlights the fact that it didn't work. Compared to other countries, the Italian cars, American cars, Japanese cars, we was out of it. And so obviously, as you can see now, at the end of the 60s, the Macmillan kind of era, after that it slowly went into a steep decline. Earlier I said about devaluation with Macmillan, he refused to devaluate. Well, basically, Harold Wilson was under pressure throughout his term, but in 1967 he agreed to devalue the pound. And basically, like I said earlier on, it made imports more expensive and exports cheaper. So that means it was basically harder for us to keep bringing things in, because we kept bringing more things in and not selling enough. It was causing a negative balance of payments. So basically, devaluation lowered the pound's value compared to others, and in real terms, that just made imports more expensive and exports going out to other countries cheaper. However, this was not popular with people, because people see devaluation as a negative thing, as a weakness in our economy. If someone devalues, you think, oh, that economy is not good, that kind of thing. So on the public world arena kind of thing, other countries looked at us as if we were economically weak. And this can even be shown by James Callaghan, who was the Chancellor, the Chancellor is basically a guy who's in charge of all the money in the economy of the government. And Callaghan actually resigned in protest because he didn't believe devaluation was the right thing to do. And that again shows how poor the economic situation was becoming, and that actually even the government itself wasn't even united in decisions that was trying to be made to alleviate the economic pressures. And as in 1A, I stated Harold Wilson basically left because he was at odds with James Callaghan and many other Labour ministers for his job, and he wasn't very popular due to the rise in trade unions striking it got very, very common strikes in the 70s especially, and this basically led to someone like Edward Heath coming in, who promised to be a bit more harder on the trade unions. And things Harold Wilson did, Heath largely got rid of. He got rid of the IRC. He got rid of the balance, He got rid of the National Board of Prices and Incomes, and got rid of all the acts as well as that. You've got to know with Heath, he did something called a Selsdon meeting, and this was basically before he won the election. He promised to do certain things for the economy. If you think about Thatcher and what she did, largely what she did was actually copying that of Edward Heath's Selsdon manifesto, and that was basically cutting things, more privatisation. He wanted to cut free school meals, free school milk, cuts to subsidies for people who lived in council houses. He wanted to raise charges for prescription of the NHS, so a bit more privatisation in the NHS. If you think about Thatcher a little bit, not quite the same, you'll be all right with Edward Heath, basically. As you can see from those kind of things, he was changing. He was breaking the post-war consensus. And that is what I said. From the 50s and 60s, it lasted. But after the 70s, the post-war consensus was no more. So as you can see, Edward Heath basically thought tax cuts, public expenditure cuts would all help the economy. Largely what Thatcher actually did do. And abolishing the National Board on Prices and Incomes Commission sums up Heath's what he wanted to do, what Heath wanted to do, because that board basically had government controlling the economy basically, and Edward Heath, much like Margaret Thatcher, wanted a free market economy. He didn't want government intervention saying this has got to happen, this has got to happen. He wanted companies and industries all competing, which you saw under Thatcher. Survival of the fittest, if you think about it like that. Each company competing, and if one goes into bust, we can't help them. It's just the free market. One obviously comes out on top, and that one should still prevail. If it can beat another company, it should stay there, rightfully so. And there was 3 problems in the world, basically, at that time when Edward Heath came in. There was large inflation throughout the world. In the UK, in 1972, 15% inflation, much like in World War One. After World War One, where I said earlier on in the 20s, MacDonald got it from 15% down to 1%. In the 72, it was at 15% again. Unemployment was 2% in 1960. Like I said, never above 300,000. But by 1972, it rose to 7%. There was high inflation at the time, 15%, and high unemployment, 7%. And the Chancellor to Edward Heath, Anthony Barber, he created something called the Barber tax cuts. And this basically did cuts of £300 million into many pieces of legislation and departments and all things. So he cut loads of things from public expenditure, thinking they would actually alleviate inflation and actually help the economy boom in this free market enterprise that he wanted. However, all you've got to know with Heath, it was free market like that, and this Barber cuts that actually happened actually was disastrous. It increased unemployment and it actually increased inflation. Because the cuts were so dramatic, so quick, it was not good for the economy at all. Everything actually increased. And he actually ended up leaving this Selsdon manifesto that he pledged to do. He ended up being a bit more like the post-war consensus again, increasing governmental intervention. And that is not what he was put in charge of the country, elected to do. He went against his mandate, and basically this sort of conservatives rip into him. Absolutely. And the people were not on his side as he broke with his promises. And Labour obviously wasn't happy with him either, because he was cutting things, and Labour is not usually the party that cuts things into people's the expenditure of the country and things like that. This increase in inflation and unemployment, which obviously the Conservatives weren't happy because he broke it, and Labour aren't impressed by the increase in unemployment. Had a massive thing which didn't help inflation, called the oil crisis of 1973, which largely affected England and Britain and many parts of the world. Basically, 1973, you've got something called the yuan Kippur War. And basically this was a war between Saudi Arabia and Israel. You don't need to go into it too much, but just mention Yom Kippur War, or the oil crisis. And basically Britain sided with Israel. And basically in this war, because we sided with Israel, OPEC, which was like a company in the Middle East, who was in charge of all the oil, and obviously oil was integral to our economy, they actually increased the prices of it by 300%, which absolutely skyrocketed inflation in countries such as France, Britain and America. And so that, for Edward Heath, did not help one bit. These rises in inflation, as well as the oil crisis, led to miners' strikes, which you will see in 1C, especially with Arthur Scargill, who actually brung down the Heath government in 1974. All you've got to know after that, from 1974 to 79, inflation went up to 17% in 77, and unemployment was roughly at 9%. Denis Healey, who was the Chancellor to James Callaghan when he came in 1976, went to the IMF again, which you saw earlier with the problems after Macmillan, where we got a £700 million loan. This time we got a £4 billion loan. But what happened this time, with the £4 billion loan, we had to promise to cut £2 billion worth of things. And basically Denis Healey, who was a Labour Chancellor, cut things such as housing, education. Notice though, they did not touch healthcare whatsoever, which you will see me talk about in 2A and 2B. He didn't touch healthcare, but he did do cuts to education, housing and defence industry, which was not happy. The Conservatives ripped into him because of the defence industry, and Labour was not happy about cuts to education and housing. And someone like Tony Benn absolutely destroyed the Labour government with what he said, and he actually led a movement which stopped the social contract, which basically, I'll talk about that one in 1C, industrial relations, but basically the social contract in 1977, was basically helping wages be restrained and stopping inflation rising. And Tony Benn, with contempt for his other members of the Labour Party at the time, led a movement and they got rid of it. And basically this saw things such as the Winter of Discontent occurring, so the Winter of Discontent, which ultimately led to Margaret Thatcher. From 1918, so obviously overall, 1918 there was a speculative boom. Then what you've got to know is there was an economic recession, 1920 to 21, recovery from 21 to roughly 29, but was hampered by the gold standard. From 29 to 34, we had an economic recession due to the Great Depression. 34 to 39 was really good due to rearmament, things like that. And World War II was not too bad, but our trade did decline by 2/3. But after it, we had post-war austerity, where rationing was introduced, and the economy wasn't quite the same, wasn't as strong before. But there were upsides, as the percentage of world trade we dominated went from 17% to 20%, and our economy grew by 4% each year. And through the 50s and 60s, due to consumerism and to post-war consensus, the economy was also booming. But as I mentioned with Macmillan, the stop-go economics gradually, alongside with consumerism, led to increased unemployment, increased inflation, and that brung down Edward Heath and ultimately brung down Harold Wilson. And due to the problems of the post-war consensus that it brung high inflation, high employment, it led to Margaret Thatcher, which is where the date stops.